Well, good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Jesse Lazar. I'm Executive Director here at AIANY New York and the Center for Architecture, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the 18th Annual Arthur Rosenblatt Memorial Lecture. Each year, we have the honor of hosting firms that focus on cultural facility design and art in ways that honor Arthur Rosenblatt's decades of work in museum design. We are honored this year to have Weiss Manfredi speak about their work today. But before I hand the mic over, I'd like to congratulate everyone on almost getting all the way through October. We are nearly at the end. We just have a couple more events this week. Book talk here tomorrow with Head High, which is our partner in Brooklyn that we do book sales with, and Pumpkitecture, which is an architectural pumpkin carving competition on Wednesday. And then mercifully, nothing on Thursday because I do not recommend coming to the Village on Halloween Day unless you are marching. So in any case, we had a wonderful festival year. This is our 14th October. We have over 100 partners, and it's been really wonderful. So we're happy to have this as one of our capstone events for that festival. I'd like to thank our sponsors for this evening, Existing Conditions, who've been a wonderful partner all year. Please say hello to them outside in the hall if you haven't had a chance to yet. As always, we're grateful for your support. And now I'd like to welcome Joseph Auld, our immediate past committee co-chair of the Cultural Facilities Committee, which plans this event, to introduce tonight's speakers. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, AIA. Good evening, guests. I want to welcome everyone to what I'm sure will be a wonderful presentation and discussion with Marion Weiss and Michael Manfredi. My name is Joseph Auld, former co-chair of the Cultural Facilities Committee. I'm a project manager and a former architect. Our volunteer committee, one of over 20 committees within the AIA New York chapter, seeks to explore and exchange ideas as they relate to cultural buildings and institutions. We do this by presenting a variety of programs throughout the year, including lectures, panel discussions, tours, and workshops. Our goal is to educate not only the professional community, but the general public on the architecture of cultural facilities. The committee meets on the second Monday of the month, and all are welcome to get involved by attending and meeting here at the center or virtually. I'd like to note the current co-chairs of the committee who also worked on this program, unfortunately could not make it tonight, Susan West and Peter Zuspin. Also, thanks to the folks that work behind the scenes at the center, Suzanne Mex and Salman Akaba. I will try to be as brief as possible to allow Marion and Michael ample time to engage in conversation and answer your questions, but first a little history on the lecture. The Arthur M. Rosenblatt Memorial Lecture on Museum Design is an AIA New York signature event. For the past 17 years of the Cultural Facilities Committee, we have presented the Rosenblatt Lecture, in which distinguished architects who have demonstrated excellence in museum design lecture on their work. This annual lecture is named after Arthur Rosenblatt, an architect dedicated to architecture in the public realm. Arthur Rosenblatt was a leading authority on museum architecture and the founder of the AIA New York Cultural Facilities Committee. A Cooper Union and Carnegie Mellon graduate, he joined the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1968 as vice president and vice director for architecture, eventually overseeing the largest expansion in the famed museum's history designed by Kevin Roche. He eventually moved to Washington to become the founding director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He was responsible for the selection of the museum's architects, James Ingo Fried, and for initiating the design process for the award-winning institution. Upon his return to New York, he was involved in a series of acclaimed urban renewal projects, including the restoration of Bryant Park and the adjoining New York Public Library. In 2007, our committee recognized Arthur's dedication by naming the premier lecture series in his honor. I'd like to thank Barbara Spandorf and Anne-Marie Baranowski, who are here and had the vision to launch this series in Arthur's honor. The committee is proud to have hosted many esteemed guests such as Marion and Michael, which are similarly, that's a tough one, dedicated to breaking ground in the realm of cultural buildings. Tonight's format will be part lecture and part conversation between the two with questions afterwards. In the interest of time, I won't be going through their lengthy list of accolades and accomplishments, but you can find them on their company website. So now, it gives me great pleasure to welcome to the center Marion Weiss and Michael Manfredi.
Thank you, Joseph. Are we clear? Well, thank you so much for that generous introduction. And just to put things in context, I think we've been inspired by Arthur Rosenblatt's legacy because his world and engagement of cultural institutions was not just the bespoke museum behind the closed walls, but one that was really expansive and civic building and about civic transformations. And so, for us, we're thrilled and honored to be here, and we'll share, 10 projects and look at the notion of what it means for symmetries to drift, because no longer does perfection that's closed and static seem to be the right way to think about cultural institutions, but somehow they need to evolve.
I think in the context of this particular lecture, which involved not only art and museum making, but also the public realm, we just should cite, I guess, the 21st anniversary of the creation of the center here, which I remember coming to New York. This was truly transformational. It really is very much at the intersection, the nexus of architecture and the public realm. So I think it's only fitting that we also recognize Arthur in the context of this 21st anniversary.
So we think about cultural institutions in many, many ways, but we're going to situate maybe something that goes a little bit further back about maybe pre-cultural institutions. What has been that urge to actually mark the land or bring art inside in fully protected environments or in fully exposed environments? And we think about the worlds that we know too little about, Lascaux Caves or even the Nazca Lines in Peru, marking the land or protecting that art and that narrative inside. And then we start to think about these museum prototypes that have certainly evolved. And in some ways, you can think about the kind of Wunderkammer, this kind of private collection, again, hermetically sealed behind the walls, but an intensity of a collection that is equally as immersive as a cave's, for instance, but still private. And then we start to think about maybe the other paradigm, which is the city as an urban artifact in many ways that has strung the landmarks of art through the city to become destinations that are truly public and in some cases infrastructural in their identity. Spanish Steps here on the right. And then we also think about museum prototypes right here in our midst as evolving elements here, where MoMA was one of the ones that said that the urban expression and also the landscape identity for sculpture, again, was important, but still, again, behind closed walls. So if we start to think about the museum as an evolving paradigm, it's one where, in some ways, it's very vulnerable to funding and economic cycles, and yet one starts to think about the budget, in this case in New York City, of just over $52 million for cultural organizations like museums, in contrast to the $3.6 billion of, in a sense, revenue. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy. And what's occurred, and certainly the pandemic really, I think, triggered some of these vulnerabilities, is that the reduction of budgets fell, staffing decreased, and many, many museums closed. So if we think about that, we also start to think about current trends. And if we focus less on the big and expensive shows or just getting larger and larger facilities, what we do start to understand there is an evolution now that Susan Taylor said so well, which is the museum field is looking at its mandate and approach in new ways, evolving from an object-oriented institution to people-centric. And this takes interesting inflections, including adding outdoor spaces like gardens and sculpture parks as an inhabitable world that no longer has walls. So Michael gave me a lot of grief about this. I like visual puns here, but if you start to think about this idea of this interior world, or one that's vulnerable and exposed to landforms always changing, what's interesting here is that these two forms here are quite memorable, and in many ways that landmark of architecture and that landmark of art are prototypes in and of themselves of inside and outside worlds. And so this question of, in a sense, no longer the perfection inside and bounded, but maybe somehow outside and further afield, has really led us to think about a book that is, if you look at your seat, coming out in January, but you can order it now with a great discount apparently, if you go for that. But in many ways, we've really been trying to unpack the things that have inspired us, which have been enduring provocations and models that look at this question of how we can look more broadly at cultural institutions.
So in fact, it's less about technology and more about, I think, the world that cultural institutions are facing. So in some ways, I think the book forms a sort of foundation for some of the kind of theses and issues that we'll share tonight. Now, I think it goes without saying we're confronting and being confronted by a very rapidly changing world. And one need not travel very far to understand that architecture is both complicit, but has the agency to address some of the challenges that we all are facing and will continue to face, including, as we know, New York has survived a very sort of challenging pandemic that's surely going to return. So I think in this rather challenging political moment, on top of everything else, we hope this talk is an act of optimism. And certainly the sort of themes of the book and themes of this talk are centered around the idea that architecture is an act of optimism. In some ways, this idea of cultural institutions also leads us to look at a number of hybrid projects that don't quite neatly fit into the categories of architecture or landscape or infrastructure. So, for example, Agrasa Kimboli in India is a gorgeous, beautiful stepwell that acts both for a kind of through an environmental agenda, but also a social agenda. And it was an opportunity for us to think deeply about projects, again, that fall between disciplines that also address current environmental issues. Or one could read the extraordinary Park Güell by Gaudi as an opportunity to channel water, provide a sort of extraordinary urban belvedere, and address a number of social and environmental conditions. And these projects, while they don't literally transcribe or transfer their sort of intelligence to the kinds of projects we do, they have been inspirational. So we'll touch on several of these projects, like the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, which in a way is an outdoor museum, or Seattle, the Olympic Sculpture Park, or Longwood Gardens, again, a different kind of museum. And we'll also talk about our current project, the Embassy in New Delhi, which talks a little bit about how to bring the culture of the United States to a very different kind of country and a different kind of climate. So we'll start with a series of projects that we'll share with you tonight. And I think we also want to kind of acknowledge the fact that Mary and I have the privilege of standing here and representing the work that occurs in our office. So I think it's important to note that it's an office that is extraordinarily talented and committed to the projects that you'll see. This is a very different kind of little museum project. We were invited by the Grafton Architects to share our work and talk about the nature of culture in a public setting, the nature of infrastructure as a cultural act. So we gathered a number of projects that we thought were inspirational, which you see in black and white, and paired them with some of the projects that we were currently working on. The idea was to create a kind of a little sort of a center in the kind of cauldron of activity that is usually associated with the Venice Biennale, a kind of a place of quiet, a little piazza, if you will. And the fabrication, of course, was also a nod to the great nautical tradition that Venice was a part of 300, 400, 500 years ago. So here you see it situated in the Arsenale, this kind of vast sea of columns, where it makes a kind of a place where you can contemplate the idea of artifacts and also contemplate them in the context of films. So it was, in a way, a multimedia event. There are opportunities to kind of be very, very intimate with a collection of models of historic precedents, but also always aware of the kind of activity. And the sort of the boat-like shell, again, builds on the sort of construction that one would have found and still finds in Venice and its adjacent areas, a sort of sense of wood that then becomes deeply stained and has a kind of inner world very different from its outer world.
And so, you know, to situate this adventure for us, which our practice, we're Weiss, Manfredi, architecture, landscape, urbanism, and in a sense that began when we began practicing together with this dissatisfaction that these fields that seem to have so much in common were stronger at the intersections between them rather than separated. We entered the Women's Memorial and Education Center competition in Washington, D.C., having never really done anything but a few speculative projects through the Architectural League. And what was very interesting is that it was really there to honor the 2 million women who had served in the military service but had never been recognized and frankly didn't get any benefits until 1972, just to give you some context. And so the site was really amazing in that it was a McKim, Mead, and White historic retaining wall that on the working drawings by McKim, Mead, and White, it said, inscriptions and statues not in contract. That's how meaningful it was as a wall. But you think about it as a forgotten site and a forgotten subject. These are the women who had served in the military as test pilots. But the question was for us, can we actually take that wall and as a metaphor for the walls that women had to break through in the military, can we break through that wall and create a place to honor them? And in that breaking through, could we create, in effect, a carved landform behind to actually tell their story of and about them through an arc of 120-foot diameter arc of glass tablets with inscriptions of and about their voices of the times they served and the meaning of what they did, seen against the backdrop of the cemetery, so that when the sun passes over the glass, and only at that time would you actually be able to read these inscriptions. So that ephemeral narrative is one that could be read at times inside and always above. But most importantly for us and for our client was to say that this would join the family of monuments in Washington, D.C. and be every bit as legible and as important as those have been honored across the river. So this opportunity to think more broadly about what museums might be, all right, more broadly about museums might be, really led us to get very excited about the Museum of the Earth in Ithaca, New York. And what was amazing to us was to think about this incredible collection of fossils from the Devonian era that have been part of that glacial retreat, which you can see in the incredible gorges around this glacial retreat forming the lakes. And for us, what became interesting was to think about not having the museum just be inside and behind the walls, but also shape the site and give measure to the forms that in fact have shaped Ithaca's incredible rich Devonian collection. And so what you can start to see here in the diagram at the site was to take the kind of provisional aspect of water detention, which historically Ithaca had carried all below grade, and we got permission to carry it above grade in a series of tiered elevations that would then actually collect all the water on the site, including the groundwater in the parking areas that we bermed and terraced, could be cleansed and actually released and brought through the site. And here you can see the existing museum that had been on the left and our addition, largely subsurface in its expression, so that it was one that would be barely a whisper on this side, but become, through its broken section, a home by which we could see the fossils. And you could see Michael and I both love to sort of, envision these things first, loosely in charcoal and in collage, and then start to think about how that museum could even tell a story. And the wonderful artist Barbara Page did a panel here for every million years of that Devonian and pre-Devonian history that would lead you to the lower levels of the exhibition halls, by which here the right whale is both an ancient and a contemporary mammal that has made its way into the collection. But the water that we talked about collecting that was shaping the earth and carving the site also then became the place of embracing that story outside one more time and allowing that kind of tactility of those fossils to make their way into the concrete walls. And to then think about a place of reflection where finally revealing itself as the two-story building that it is, that water being collected in a place of reflection and ultimately making its way into a new water detention pond before it could be released into Lake Cayuga. So again, this whole idea from the earth to the earth and being recycled so that actually a new wildlife and environment could be formed was as central to the museum identity as any could be. And that takes us really to the question of what it does mean to think of cultural institutions and, in fact, museums, and also recognize that botanic gardens are very interesting, cultivated, and collected cultural institutions that have a very fragile collection at hand, and is one where we were lucky enough to be able to do the visitor center and think about what it meant to actually be looking at that collection from the edge of the city, which had originally been just at the edge of this parking lot. And then if you could see below the central Cherry Esplanade, we were asked to put our building right at the terminus of that, where you would go through the parking lot, enter the visitor center, and enter right on that green. Our thought was that the beauty of this collection is one that it's discovered, and the experience of the garden is really far more compelling. So we thought it would be interesting to relocate the site to the very edge of the city where 44,000 people lined up to go through this turnstile on Mother's Day, and think about what that might mean if it were really a chameleon where it was part urban at the edge of the city and 100% landscape as it made its way into the collection of the garden. So you can start to see this sort of Janus-like drifting symmetries, if you will, part architecture, part landscape, making its way from the edge of the city as something that is really more an inhabitable topography, but with its copper roof mirroring the buildings that were part of the Gardens Administrative Center, but wandering through and making its way as a section that begins at the lower edge as 100% architecture and at the upper edge as 100% landscape. So you can see this idea of being drawn by shadows into the garden and making a choice whether it's on the right to enter the garden or the left to enter the city. And then even think about what it means to curate a building that actually has to work very carefully around the collection. And in the collection of the garden is this very rare green flowering cherry tree. And so the edge of the building and its foundations follow the drip line of that canopy. And then so too, when we make our way inside, the narrative of really what it means to explore the collection is to try to bring you out with a little bit more insight in the visitor center about what you're discovering on their 52 acres. And then occasionally have an opportunity to gather as a community in what is, in our mind, probably the only room that's two-sided that can host 160. But if you look to your left, you can also see that it's embedded in the hillside.
So it's interesting, when we talk the Botanic Garden, and as recently as several weeks ago, they talk about their collection, they talk about the visitor experience. So it very much, while they might not call themselves a kind of traditional museum, see themselves as having a didactic role that for us, I think was kind of central to how we thought of this project. And in fact, you can start to see that in this two-sided room, the sectional capabilities, we wanted to make that kind of very evident. So you can enter high or enter low at street level. And at times, the building virtually disappears, or sometimes it kind of softly glows and has a presence that is purely architectural. But we also, I think, part of the Botanic Garden's mandate was to think about this building, again, having a didactic role. It does have a green roof. Of course, we all know what the kind of extraordinary capabilities of green roofs are, but we virtually collect every drop of water into a series of rain gardens that then are transferred to the Japanese pond, which some of you may have had an opportunity to visit. And then that's part of a larger system of keeping all the water on site. So Marion mentioned the building's form, and the building's form in some ways acknowledges the kind of drip lines of several trees, which you start to see here, and has a kind of topographic or sectional quality to it. This is a very early image of the green roof, which had been kind of carefully planted as an ongoing experiment. The idea is that the roof wasn't just something beautiful, but something that the Botanic Garden could continuously curate, and again, find value and find real research in how green roofs can survive in our environment in New York. We recently were asked to expand, in effect, extend the garden and extend the visitor experience to create a connection to the subway lines. Currently, the garden is bifurcated sectionally so that someone in a wheelchair or a family pushing a series of strollers has a very hard time getting from one side of the garden to the other. So this was an opportunity to take the last little stretch of unclaimed territory, this kind of steep hill, which in a way you can start to see it was starting to fade and starting to fail, and develop, in effect, an ADA ramp that is about 400 feet long that creates a series of belvederes. So rather than just a ramp getting from A to B, it becomes part of the museum experience, working very closely with Toby Wolf, who's a specialist in plantings. We imagine this linear route as quite literally a visitor experience where you could take in not only the kind of prospect of the garden, but also a level of intimacy. Of course, building something that starts as a sort of simple charcoal sketch takes an extraordinary amount of effort. And again, I think we need to acknowledge the talents of our office. So this is now opened just at the end of COVID. In fact, you can see folks with masks on. But the plantings are positioned, and we've kind of, in a way, thought of them as exhibition material, where they're planted at various elevations. So you can smell, and they're fragrant. They change seasonally. And you can start to see in this film the sense of choreography, which for us is very important in our work, the idea that architecture is about the choreography of space. So moving from New York City down to the uncharted territories of Florida, we recently completed the Baker Museum there. And this was, in a way, the child of the aftermath of Hurricane Irma, which quite literally took part of the skin of this existing building, which you see circled in red, and there was a tremendous amount of infiltration of water and dampness, so the museum had to completely shut down and be renovated. In the process, it was an opportunity to also expand the museum so that it wasn't just about art, but it was about performance. Again, the qualities of how we experience space and how that kind of experience in a way triggers multiple arts is something that is not only of great interest to us, but we're seeing cultural institutions being much more expansive about how they think about art. It was also an opportunity, particularly given the kind of context of Florida and the beginnings of COVID, a sense of thinking about the outdoor space as a protagonist, just as important as the interior galleries or performing spaces. So the museum, in a way, opens itself up to accommodate multiple activities. So you can start to see the original museum, and this was sort of in red. We've ghosted the areas that were heavily damaged, but it also had this kind of insular mausoleum-like quality, which I don't think was intentional, but certainly sends that kind of message. So we took that down, and I think makes the argument that sometimes great architecture, interesting architecture, works best by removal. We're always programmed to add more, and yet at times taking things down, and in this case heavily damaged, to create something that is more public, in effect opening the museum up to a larger public, was something that was deeply, I think, embedded not only in the trustees but in our own work. And then from this gallery, you can either go right into a lobby, or you can ascend to a kind of piano nobile, much more protected against the flooding that is likely to keep occurring in Florida.
So the interesting thing about this transformation is that the museum had been a box, and it was again very introverted. And so the question was, how could that connection of inside and outside start to have a common ground? And how could that sense of movement be something where you have a sense of where you are, wherever you are? You have an ability to travel outside that box, to be connected to the outside between gallery spaces. And then find yourself even in these side galleries or breakout areas where natural light is a kind of welcome respite from some of the more traditional galleries themselves. And what was very interesting in this restoration is that all the artwork had to be completely removed, of course, and they were thankfully able to preserve all of it. But the real question was, how do we actually even restore things like cork floors? And we were fortunate enough to be able to restore rather than replace many of them. And yet, what we were able to add to, and that's where this idea of what does a museum have to be? Well, sometimes a museum has to open its world up. And because in this case, it was part of Artist Naples, which also has a philharmonic, being able to add rehearsal spaces and meeting spaces became a tremendous opportunity to extend its vitality and engagement, to allow that engagement to then reach to the outside. And also, most importantly, recognize that it could still be a place of transformation. And where Michael had showed that very large, fully enclosed plexiglass bubble, which was their event space, the recognition that the removal of it could offer so much more, could allow sculpture, community, and engagement to be part of that experience. So this question of what does a box do when a box has not done everything that maybe the promise of a museum has always wanted to do became a very important question in Tampa. The Tampa Museum of Art worked with Stanley Sadowitz, who did a very beautiful building. And if you can look at this aerial view, it was a beautiful perforated aluminum box, and next to a parking garage and overlooking a park and the very beginnings of a river walk. And in some ways, this was Tampa trying to claim a relationship now with the river as its cultural necklace rather than the heart of the city, as it had traditionally been. But if you look closely, one of the things that was very challenging is that the budget had been very, very lean, and so the entire ground floor was devoted to storage and art handling. As a result, everything on the ground floor was back-painted glass, and all the collections were brought upstairs. Additionally, there were all kinds of challenges of other things that had to be accommodated, so the museum's galleries were limited as well. So one of the things that became an opportunity was to actually think about what it would be if that glass were removed. And in this case, on this particular side, the entry could be the new education center. And this is Vinnick Education Center, where literally everything on the ground floor that had been storage is now a place of engagement. You see the train, you can see the art on the graffiti on the parking garage. But also there in the arts education lobby, this is the work that could literally celebrate the work that the children who have been working in these studios could do. And most importantly, and you can see these folks looking through the glass to give a sense that the promise of making art is very much at the heart of what it means to be in this museum as opposed to just seeing it upstairs. And then upstairs we had this incredible opportunity to do this detective work. The floor to ceilings were hugely generous. And to be able to say we could actually consolidate and condense so much of the behind the scenes work so that we could add now almost 100% more gallery space than ever existed there. And so these are all new galleries that had been in art handling spaces that were no longer on view. And again, this is really some of the additional spaces that were invented. And in so doing, it obligated us to do something very wonderful, we thought, which was to create the art storage and the art handling space as one that could almost be a Kunsthal in and of itself for those who actually could get access to behind the scenes, but most importantly, let the museum actually manage their collection incredibly well. And so in some spaces, it could be that those super beautiful triple height spaces had never yet been organized to be able to not only have work on the walls, but to suspend them. And so you can start to see there, and Jacob Hashimoto's piece Suspended there, which is quite beautiful, being able to inhabit these volumes in new ways, because this had been a place where art was not, but simply a lobby and ticketing.
So, in a way, this was a little bit of an act of humility because, and detective work, because I think the Stanley Sadowitz building is really quite beautiful.
Beautiful.
So, in a way, it was maybe like acupuncture. How could we kind of leverage its elegant proportions and generous spaces and find ways to create new opportunities within the box? But we were also asked, how could we then expand? So, adjacent to the box, between the existing Sadowitz building and that parking garage, there's a new addition. And here, the promise of a building providing shade, but also announcing its presence along the Hillsborough River, was an opportunity to kind of think about this as a 90-foot long cantilever that increases the public space. So about 2 years ago, you could start to see this photo. The metasequoia trees are starting to die, and there's no ADA access to the museum along the waterfront. So what we proposed was a very, very gentle ramp, much grander stairs, a more appropriately scaled waterfront. So there's a kind of urban agenda that is paired with a kind of cultural agenda of expanding the museum. And you can start to see the edge of Stanley Sadowitz's very elegant perforated metal box. Inside there are larger galleries for contemporary work, including digital work. There's a terrace overlooking the river for sculpture. And you can start to see the importance of shade, particularly in Florida. Well, it's true here too, but especially in Florida, where the sense of being outside offers a level of promise, but also the sense that it can offer a shaded area of respite. There's a theater, which the curtains rise, and you could start to look into the theater, or alternately, if you're in the theater, look out onto the river. So you can start to see how it will start to transform itself from day to night. So the Olympic Sculpture Park, I think we've talked about this project, and we've had an opportunity to come back to it 5-10 years after it's opened. And it is very much a situation where, like many orphan sites, very much on the water's edge. And you can start to see the kind of impact that that has had in Seattle. So many years ago, about 20 years ago, the Seattle Art Museum held a competition to reclaim these 3 sites. And our proposal, and I won't go into it in great detail, takes the idea that infrastructure doesn't need to be completely concealed. It can be celebrated, so the passage of trains becomes an opportunity to think about them as mobile and kinetic art. The agenda is to create a sculpture park that also has an environmental agenda, and the nexus of the environment and art is increasingly, I think, for us and for many museums, intertwined. So the idea of creating a kind of prospect against which you could see sculpture in this sort of magical setting meant also recreating the topography that had been lost when the site was a brownfield site. So there was a strong environmental agenda to reclaim the topography, some 44 feet, and allow a setting that could change over time, which it has been, to include art that has yet to be placed or extraordinary pieces of art like Richard Serra's Wake, which you see here. I think we were privileged to be able to work with Richard to help frame and locate this extraordinary piece of art. So that in and of itself was a kind of great lesson, whether you see it at night, at dusk, or early morning. And then there's also a kind of Kunsthal, because it was very important for the museum to sort of create a setting where art could be much more closely aligned with a series of events, much more approachable. So the museum opened with a piece by Pedro Reyes, these beautiful pupellas, which invite children and adults to kind of nest into, and then he had this kind of mural that talked about the industrialization of Seattle. And since there's been a number of artists invited, like Spencer Finch's beautiful Western Mystery, or Solowitz' Seven Cubes. So that always a sense of bringing art to a public that typically would not want to walk into or know how to approach art. Or this piece by Sandra Chintos, which is beautiful. These are silver marker pens. There's probably close to 300,000 or 400,000 lines on the wall. But it's also a place for cultural events.
And so the diversity of events here for us, and I think for the museum, is the real joy that no matter what has been scripted from the very outset, it's been recast and re-inhabited and effectively taken over by the city in ways that we had never imagined. But what we love is that sense of the landscape against the urban edge and against the kind of place of discovery is one where art needs room to breathe, but also that place that offers room to breathe is where the community can come together for concerts and outdoor events. And yet it's also a place of reflection called the Olympic Sculpture Park because of the Olympic Mountains Beyond, and the very first piece that was acquired, Calder's Eagle, is seen there against now this earthwork, 200,000 cubic yards of earth, creating this new landform to be able to look out at the horizon. And so that's really part of what was shown here in our charcoal sketch here was just saying that it is an invention. It's a landform that crosses a highway, crosses train tracks. It dealt with a failing seawall, and it dealt with a 44-foot grade change. And yet, if we could actually make all these things look as if they were one thing because of another, but not diminish their contrast, but amplify them, so dead center on this Elliott Avenue, which is a federal trucking route, you could actually know when you were above at its point, at the center of that crossing. But it's also saying that that question that Michael had sort of mentioned earlier in the project is that the art of infrastructure, the art of a community building, and the art of connecting a city to its water's edge truly says that the cultural lens is one that can be infrastructural as well. And it's infrastructural enough so that if you're, on the highway there or the Elliott Avenue, you could enter the park or see the horizon of art. Or more importantly, if you're on the BNSF train or Amtrak, you could actually see Teresita Fernandez's beautiful work here called Seattle Cloud Cover. Or if you're a train spotter, which apparently is a very large community, you can overlook the trains. But here's her work, and we created this framework for her art piece. And you can also see those scaling walls themselves overlapping for seismic resilience in this very unusual environment. And yet as we reached the water's edge, which was a very slender patch, we had to have bike lanes and pedestrian lanes, but also places to gather all the water that had been collected from the site to actually be held in these detention areas before they were released into the water's edge. Jaume Plenza, a more recent piece on the water's edge, actually has this silhouette that is every bit as compelling as the Calder Eagle. But most importantly, here you could see it was also a piece of infrastructure that you could barely see, but importantly, building an environmental habitat for salmon, and juvenile salmon at that. And all of that actually helped stabilize the failing seawall, and over time it has restored the ecosystem at the water's edge and has become the model for the park that is extending along the water's edge. But for us, I think the idea of art making its way outside of the walls of the museum and wandering from the city to the water's edge is one where that sense of it being in motion rather than static or contained is about actually an active building connection to the city and building a connection through art. So from the northern side of the West Coast to the southern side, La Brea Tar Pits Museum and Master Plan in Los Angeles is one where literally rather than building something above, if you will, which is what the Olympic Sculpture Park did, this was about discovering things that were underneath. And if anybody knows anything about the history of La Brea Tar Pits, as you can imagine, so much of LA was founded by the great, oil and tar that was discovered. And yet there it was, this legacy of the past, and the city in a hurry to get to its future, but held up because what they discovered underneath the earth were incredible fossils, 20 million years in the making, the largest consolidated Pleistocene collection, and it literally is still the largest active urban paleontological site in the world. So what do you do when in fact there's active excavation going on site and there is a museum? And how do you make that research and the idea of a museum and the idea of being a public city park actually feel as if it's woven together because of each other instead of one thing after another? So we started to think about both time and place, and thinking about the Holocene, Anthropocene, and Pleistocene as something that if we could imagine wandering across this site that has excavation and research, that has a public green, that has the kind of spectacle of those fictional mastodons and mammoths in the lake pit, and a museum that needed expanding, could we make sense of it with a triple loop? And so you can start to see here in this aerial view, some of you may know the construction Peter Zumthor's designed LACMA in the distance, but it was saying that all these idiosyncratic elements you could discover at any given moment, and these loops would draw into focus. And in 1 kilometer, you could experience both contemporary time and community gathering. But most importantly, what you could see was the earthwork that had existed there that hid the collection. On the right-hand side, which is the original museum, we extended that earthwork a little further, you can see on your left, and then opened it up so that we could reveal that collection hidden inside and actually think about crossing that lake pit as a place of a journey of discovery rather than entering across the asphalt that had been the front door of the museum before.
So this was very much about taking the original Page Museum, which you see on the right, which was actually hermetic, quite literally buried into a berm, and kind of cracking it open, and in a way acknowledging the fact that the active paleontological research was very much part of the exhibition. And one could, we hope, wander across the lake pit, go for a jog, see what's happening in terms of active excavation, and then wander into the museum, perhaps intrigued with the sense that real science is happening here. Typically, the kind of the sort of pièce de résistance, in a way, was the sort of giant mastodons or the saber-toothed cats. But what's fascinating about the research that they're finding now is that through the technology of examining microfossils and pollen, scientists have determined that the Pleistocene was the last era of climate change. So there's incredible wealth of knowledge and renewed interest in this. So how to make this kind of relevant? Again, it's our hope that one could either enter the museum proper and then be seduced into wandering into the site, or in reverse, wander through the garden, the public green, and then find the treasures inside that might allow you to understand this little larger climate change picture. So it's a very sectional project. And while we know that the interiors will be heavily curated, the idea is taking this sort of treasure chest of fossils and allowing them to have a didactic role and an architectural role is something that we're starting to explore with the museum. But it's also a place of kind of darkness, the sort of sense of unearthing the past and moving from light to dark and dark to light. And then also the spectacle. After all, this is in LA, so the sense of taking this story and bringing it out to the public in new and perhaps surprising ways.
So if we think about what it means to actually think about art and cultural gathering places, we've talked about the traditional museum, we've talked about botanic life as a kind of collection in a museum, we've talked about in that recent example, something that is unseen until it has been revealed and curated as part of a public realm. So that becomes very interesting when we think about the embassy, which has its own art program, is a place of diplomacy and engagement. And we're fortunate to be working on the U.S. Embassy in India. We're in year 4 of construction right now and have 5.5 more years to go. But the interesting thing there is India has a past that is so extraordinary. And Edward Durrell Stone, over half a century ago when he did the U.S. Embassy in India, drew inspiration from the Taj Mahal and a symmetric idea in a full reflecting pool. And yet we were also, as we came in here, realized that there were several other, over the 27 acres, several other opportunities to be inspired by the landscape as well as the architecture, in particular Lodi Garden here on your right. And that idea that, in fact, diplomacy and the place of diplomacy is an art form that we're very hopeful in the next 4 years will still have value. We start to think about what it means to be the place of that kind of cultural destination. Well, it's a place that needs to be transformed to become more resilient over time, but also, and you can look at the historic elements that had to be saved there in red and the full site covering 2 city blocks. The question was, could we restore but also renew? And so what we started to do was to think about across these 2 city blocks how to connect new and existing entries and actually create a journey through this kind of cultural necklace, if you will, of diplomacy from end to end across the city blocks and restore this as a place rather than just a single building that's well known into a linear garden which in many ways creates a campus identity, and upon that create the new buildings that you can see that are on the upper register. But also looking at this as a chance of environmental preservation here. Water is either excessive in the monsoon season or completely absent in the dry season. And so rather than wasting water through evaporation, which the large reflecting pool, for instance, did, we are collecting everything and both storing it, but also doing groundwater recharge. And in the proposed site plan that you can start to see, there really is a sense of trying to create a campus environment that transcends just the building by building reading. And it's a system of entries where walls, in fact, are garden creators and are also creators of the place or the environment of diplomacy. And in the composite here, we're looking at that possibility that arrival through this kind of landscape or this threshold is one where we could see at the same time both the historic Edward Durrell Stone building, but also the new embassy building that we're creating opposite it, but at the same pier height. Now, to do this became very interesting. We were very interested in actually not exceeding the stature height of this, and so very much of the program itself is actually below grade and illuminated by gardens. But that reflecting pool, which had lost so much water just through evaporation, is one now where we have changed it to have the very thinnest skim of water, and beneath it actually having effectively 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools of water collection and storage that can be used on the site year-round. And that idea of water being an element that has a role both symbolically but also performatively is something that Michael will build on right here.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting when we were digging a little more deeply into how museums function. There is a very clear visitor experience. There's a kind of narrative to how museums and embassies reveal themselves. So as you can start to see, Marion talked about the skim of water, so evaporative cooling becomes central, but also this very, very strong horizontal shade canopy, this sort of umbrella, urban umbrella, provides ample shade as you slide into the museum, into the embassy. Again, thinking about this through the lens of a kind of cultural institution. And you enter into increasingly private and special honorific spaces. Again, cool, because India can be extremely hot. Marion talked about the idea of programming a large portion of the office areas below ground, and they're animated here. Again, it's a sectional project that allows us not only to capture water, but these lower level gardens, these sunken gardens, bring in natural light to probably about 40% of the building itself. But it also was an opportunity for us to think about the landscape as sculptural elements that in a way could teach. And these are all local, but also, given the selection, highly sculptural. So the sense of the chroma of the different kinds of landscapes would play a very significant role in how the embassy revealed itself, not only to visitors, but those who used it. And there are a number of art pieces, in this case, Barty Kerr, who is an American Indian artist, and her piece is using local marbles to create this beautiful floor pattern. Spencer Finch, who for some reason we seem to be doing a number of projects with Spencer, was chosen, and these chromas come from Indian tapestries, so there's a kind of connection to the culture of India. And similarly, it was an opportunity for us to rethink the jolly screen, which is both a very ancient way of modulating light and heat, and acknowledging Edward Durrell Stone's attempts to create a vernacular that was both international but also specific and local. So in this kind of charcoal sketch, you can start to see the kind of vertical striations of our building, which is on your right, and acknowledging the sense or the kind of conversation it might have with the Edward Durrell Stone project. So lots of studies about how to handle this harsh, bright sunlight, including a mock-up. So you can start to see the kind of woven precast panels allow you to look outside, but also provide significant shade during very, very bright days. You can start to see how that kind of pattern plays out, particularly as you see it on the oblique. So it has this sort of changeable quality. It's different frontally, but also very different on the oblique. And then you can start to see in this kind of sketch the sort of interplay between outside and inside, between the kind of mineral quality of the building and the aqueous quality of the skim of water.
So this last project, we're going to share with a little bit of trepidation because it opens on November 22nd, and we're still deeply into the punch list phase. So you'll forgive the evolving nature of this. But what's super interesting is, if any of you know, DuPont was Elon Musk of the era, and the evolution of this crystalline ridge, as we're calling it, was one where it was a place where there were beautiful conservatories and beautiful gardens, but then there were a collection of production greenhouses and turnstiles for an entry and parking lots and a few other things that made the experience of being at Longwood Gardens, which are extraordinary, at 1,100 acres, probably the most visited garden in the country. And as you can look at this aerial view in the upper register, you could start to see where the really famous conservatories were, and in the lower part of it, you could see where the parking and the production greenhouses were. And what we started to think about was the possibility of imagining a new sequence of gardens and conservatories together, and envision something where this kind of rolling topography of the Brandywine Valley and the adjacent Abandi Fields and the crispness that we associated with the historic conservatory could be seen as related to each other rather than in opposition. And in that case, we were super interested in the idea of a conservatory not as they were in the traditional Longwood, which was a lot of concrete aggregate columns and a roof, a clear glass roof on top, but something more like and akin to being within a forest grove, where the columns themselves might actually branch out and create an environment that was welcoming enough to host a garden, and in this case actually welcoming enough by a reflection body of water here to allow you to experience thresholds very differently. And what was wonderful was working in collaboration with Reed Hildebrand to create a landscape inside that they developed this beautiful Mediterranean garden that brought that water not only from the outside and the inside, so the ambiguity of inside and outside, of landscapes inside and outside, meant that this particular collection here, this Mediterranean collection, is one where we could think of it thriving in very dry environments, but also thriving when it's very, very wet. In many ways, a model for what artificial climates might have to do as we look forward in the kind of future horizon. So it's really designed to be a living, breathing building. And while we did many, many buildings in the complex that were effectively rejuvenating the use of the gardens, from a library to a restaurant to classroom buildings and many others, this became the heart of that living, breathing agenda. Water conservation is important. Earth ducts make their way through the site, 3,000 linear feet, bringing in the 53-degree temperature of the earth to actually cool it and heat it. Ground source heat pumps, natural ventilation, so that the entire perimeter and the rooftop are live and actively ventilated and tuned by the weather. So you can start to see actually that subsurface debris, if you will, as it was starting to come together. You can start to see the water holding tanks in the distance, and you can see those earth tubes kind of wandering their way through the earth to come and actually offer that temperate environment inside. And the living, breathing factor means that these walls, which are activated by climate, by time of day, by time of year, are also in action with the water, so that that displacement ventilation and the aquatic plants are also as much a part of the outside environment as they are inside. You can start to see that dip or that catenary in there. And what we were very interested in is not so much the static straight lines of the conservatoire, but more like the topographic and relaxed geographies of the hillside. And those would be seen in a way as a new, renewed identity. But in the renewal of the garden, one piece was about to be lost, which was the last extant Roberto Burle Marx Cascade Garden. And so rather than, you could see where it was hidden in the end of the greenhouse collection, we together said, let's, with Longwood Garden and the Burle Marx Foundation in Brazil and Reed Hildebrand, we together said, let's give it a new heart and center. And so every element of it was literally repositioned. Actually, gardens actually have to keep their exact orientation. And we designed this new house for it, a new glass house, that actually could offer that sense of being in the understory to the Brazilian forest. And so you'll notice that the glass is darker than the conservatory glass. And on your right, the beautiful water lily court, Sir Peter Shepherd, we rejuvenated and framed now with a new arcade that could then connect the historic and that past together. So here's Roberto Burle Marx during his oeuvre doing all these drawings so exacting. They purchased all the plants he suggested. And at the end of the day, he said, purchase more, and he planted everything that he hadn't specified in a particular bespoke fashion. And so when they tried to reproduce that, they fortunately had all the notes and were able to recast that and reposition every stone with the assistance of Milner, historic architect. And yet all of it is really seen in this rejuvenated focus of new and old, where that kind of journey between both and garden and structures, the collection inside and out. Michael will close it out.
Yeah, I think this was a case of, at times, being very, very modest. This was, you can see in the foreground, Sir Peter Shepherd's very beautiful sculptural planar garden. Actually recalls the kind of great gardens of the 50s and 60s. So our contribution was to kind of frame it with a new arcade that provided shade and, in effect, gave the garden a kind of a framing opportunity. But we were intrigued with the sense of the play of water. Every single surface collects water, so we're treating water in a very precious way. And Marion talked about the roof. The roof, in a way, acknowledges the very beautiful topography of the Brandywine Valley. And that sense of seeing it, and this photo was literally taken just a week and a half ago, the sense of the building as being an active protagonist, but also carrying on in, we hope, a new way, the kind of tradition of conservatories. At times, it captures the quality of light and becomes very, very ethereal, but you can start to see, Marion talked about the columns. The columns actually become beams, so it's a very unusual structural system. It's a series of bent moment frames that together act in unison. So you can start to see the kind of interplay between the pleated roof, which captures water, and the curvilinear beams. And they have a reciprocity, which you'll see in a few slides. But that sense of a simple geometry in plan then becomes a much more complex roof form with these folds offering a sort of sense of perspectival convergence as you move through the space. And you can start to see that played out here. So virtually every moment frame, every kind of sequence of columns was slightly different. Fantastic fabricators, and this was done in Germany by Roschmann, and then shipped and erected like a giant Amish barn raising event. So both American and German technologies. So this photo, again, super recent. You can start to see the kind of interplay between the structure and this sort of diaphanous mirror-like scrim of water. And then on the inside, there's a sort of interplay between the lush landscapes and the kind of crisp sort of islands. And as the landscapes grow and mature, that kind of reciprocity will be, I think, even more intertwined. You can see the columns starting to kind of weave their way both laterally and longitudinally. At times, there's a kind of a little rill of water, which you see here. So there's always the sense of water. And then the ground plane, as Marion noted, is in effect a kind of sculptural system of sculptural elements, vegetal sculptural elements. And we love the sense that there's a kind of interplay, the kind of bosque, the large significant bosque of plane trees, which you just see outside the perimeter, in a way start to talk to the architecture of the columns and beams. And that sort of sense of shifting geometries, we hope, will allow you to kind of think about the architecture and the landscape and the garden in a kind of constant conversation. So that sort of inside-outside dialogue, we hope, is apparent not only by day, but also by night. And you can start to see the kind of early morning light plays out as the sun starts to set and becomes much more of an evening shot. So in conclusion, we hope we can see architecture as a kind of an optimistic act, one that redefines itself more broadly by engaging landscape, infrastructure, and urbanism. And we return to, I think, one of our favorite quotes by one of our favorite architects, Alvaro Siza. This quote is so prescient. Architects don't invent anything, rather they transform reality. Thank you.
Come join us. Do you guys want? Okay, we're going to start the Q&A, but I have a few questions first, if you don't mind. The first one, you talked about very graciously your talented team. Can you tell us a little bit about the talents that you look for when you're hiring and the culture that you're nurturing?
First of all, we feel incredibly blessed by the team we have in our office. We're constantly inspired by them, challenged by them, but I think for us the most important thing is that everybody has a different collection of talents and ages and experiences, and yet the thing we value the most is that they're all inclined to be generous with each other. We're finding that the people who are most senior are being mentored by the most junior ones in some of our virtual paradigms that are getting more robust. And I think we're all benefiting from the diverse experience that we've all had. So maybe Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I wish there was a formula. I'd certainly pass out cards tonight to see if anybody fit that formula. But I think we spend a lot of time interviewing, and we also talk to our colleagues. So I think, in a way, the community that we have in the studio is part of a larger community. Marion and I both teach, so we have an opportunity to see emerging talent. And also, as Marion said, it's how we all engage each other in the context of a studio. Because I think it goes without saying, it's a creative act, but it's a social act too, what we do.
The next one, your clients. Can you give us a little bit of background on what changes a good client to a great client, almost like a patron of the arts?
We feel ridiculously blessed with the clients we've had. And I think what has made us so fortunate with these good clients becoming great clients is that they've been aware that they don't know what they want it to be, but they know they want to get there on the journey with you. And they're not so deferential to the art of what we're doing that they don't feel unable to be able to speak to it as an art, if you will. And also understand that we have enormous pragmatic obligations, but one of the biggest pragmatic obligations is, say, staying on budget. And a challenged client might not know that there's 1,000 ways to get there if the conceptual armature is strong, as opposed to, well, we can't afford this part, let's cut it off. So that makes a challenging client, and a great client is one who knows they don't know the answer, but they know that there's an armature that might be transcendent and become something extraordinary.
Actually, there's some very good architects in the audience, so I'd love to hear their take. But we enter a lot of competitions, and often interviews are competitions. And in a way, it's painful at times as that is, it's a way you can gauge whether the fit is right. And often we'll enter a competition if the question is the right question. Is there an ambition? So it's in a way self-selecting, because in turn, I think the architects who pick the clients who pick us as architects must find something in how we respond to their question. So I think that we found is probably the best way for us to find that kind of, that synergy.
Nice, very nice. Okay, last question for me. A little bit on the future for Weiss Manfredi, but also the future for museum design. You spoke about communities and walls opening up. Is that part of the future that you foresee?
I think one of the most exciting things for us is that the horizon ahead for architecture has really moved away from what I would call purely exclusive, exquisite form making to something that is informed by larger ambitions for welcoming in more diverse communities, for welcoming in programs that had normally been outside, particularly of museums' walls. And for us, I think what we're struck by in the horizon ahead is that museum directors, boards, and communities recognize that a museum can die if it's no longer growing and changing, and it can become a static artifact of the past pretty quickly, because the mission that might have established it, if it doesn't grow and change, is in trouble. And so what we're excited about now is institutions are really aware of the strengths of what they have. They don't want to diminish that intrinsic value of what they were hoping to achieve, but they are also adding and including now a whole array of dimensions that enable people to feel like they don't need to know the libretto to enter, but that they should enter everywhere and anywhere.
Yeah, I think I would kind of expand that definition, say all cultural institutions are at a very, very challenging moment, because the competition is extraordinary, the digital world is at your fingertips. So how does a cultural institution stay relevant? And in a way, its relevance isn't by trying to compete with the digital world. Its relevance is understanding the kind of larger climactic condition, but also the larger social condition. So what does that mean? Tampa is interesting. When we started to do that project, we found that they were the most significant art educational venue in that, probably within 100 miles. Every public educational system in Florida is abdicating the arts. So they actually moved into a position of filling that void and have now become incredibly relevant. And they've reinvented themselves as not only a museum, but an educational institution. So that's a case, I think, of us wanting to perhaps end on an optimistic note. I think we as architects have the capability to think more broadly, just as the cultural institutions have that capability.
Okay, let's open it up to the audience. Amada has a microphone. Anyone has questions?
Front two.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. This is all very beautiful. Were there spaces that you grew up looking at or walking through that inspired your way into social life, say now? There were places when you were kids that were just so different that made you want to create something like the places you're showing us?
Sure. Yeah, well, I'll start. I was lucky enough to grow up in Rome, Italy. And I remember playing in the Villa Giulia, which is a museum, but it's also a great villa, and the garden is just as extraordinary as the villa. So the reciprocity of Vignola's garden and Vignola's villa, I think, still resonates with me in a very, very fundamental way.
You know, it's a great question, and I think that whether these are retroactive manifestos or whether we truly are influenced by how and where we grew up, I think it's more the latter. I grew up in the hills of Northern California, and right next door to our house was Foothill Junior College, designed by Ernest Kump, and the landscape architecture was by Peter Walker. And I was a cross-country runner, and we did all of our training on those hills. And I loved it so much because all the architecture had looked like Japanese pavilions sublimated into the hillside, and the trees and the topography were what were celebrated. So when I was applying to architecture schools, I called up to find out who the architect was who designed it, because I thought it was so great, called him, asked his advice, visited him as his office, not knowing he didn't have a little atelier of 7, he had 300 people. Asked him where I should go to school, and he said University of Virginia, because architecture and landscape were seen together, and that was what I had valued there. So I think we are deeply influenced by those worlds.
Abby? I'm good. You got it.
Make it seem as if those projects went so smooth. It's really quite misleading. Many of us know that it's not like that.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if there are some projects that are kind of still nightmarish in your mind that you could kind of point to and how you handle that.
Michael, that's a good one for you.
Yeah, I knew Miriam was going to do that. Thank you, Miriam. I would say that all projects go through a nightmarish, great word, moment. And how you handle them probably depends on the particular moment in your career or the particular moment in the life of the project. The Seattle Art Museum, for example, reached a point where they couldn't agree. The waterfront was actually owned by the city. The museum had acquired the 2 upland lots. And there was a trolley barn that many folks felt very, very romantically attached to it. I don't know if you know that. And there were petitions to keep it. But when folks understood that what they were going to get was a renewed waterfront, logic and good sense prevailed, but it took about 9 months of anguished committee and community meetings that we all go through. And it took a lot of patience on our part and the museum's part. And every project, again, has that kind of moment where you're terrified that it's going to just collapse under its own weight.
Can I just ask, is anything referring to any of that difficulty going in the book?
No. We'll be happy to talk to you about it. You know, these nightmare things, you got to get rid of them quickly, otherwise you just get paralyzed. I think it's a self-defensive mode. But we both teach, and we are eyes wide open. We also are very clear about how we talk about the process of architecture, particularly in the public realm, with our students. So that's an opportunity to talk about the nightmare that might turn into a good dream.
I used to teach architecture, and this was very important to me that students get a sense of that. So I asked them to find would-be clients, and in teams of 2 or 3, they would find some relative or friend who was experienced in that building type. One year it was all, this was when architecture students at NJIT were still mostly male, found nursery school teachers. And then one person found somebody who worked in a retirement community, but it was really a nursing home. And what he described eventually became a specialty among students, and it was more of a retirement community that had library and all of that kind of invention in the new type. And I think that whole struggle is so important to present because, as you said, the nightmare can turn into beauty. And I think that hard part deserves more attention, I would say.
Good point. Very nice.
speak loudly. We've had the pleasure of knowing both of you for some time now. And this isn't a question, it's more of just a statement publicly. We've known you to be very generous and really wonderful colleagues in the profession. That's one thing, good enough. But the fact that you're also creative and professional and very profound architects, the mix of those two things is very rare. So we just wanted to say thank you for all of that and wishing you good fortune.
Huge thanks to Craig and Elaine, who we admire so much.
Any others? There we go.
When you were working on the expansion of the embassy in New Delhi, was the ghost of a certain French architect on your mind? Because there was some formal language like around that big entry area that kind of reminded me of the work that Le Corbusier did in India. And did you kind of think through that this is a layer of information that we should consider as a post-colonial condition that is part of the language to investigate?
You know, I think that that's a really interesting question. What we were struck by is that we were looking at structures like the Red Fort, and we were looking at many of the kind of walled sort of compounds in India, including Fatehpur Sikri. And so in many ways, arguably, you could say that very same French architect may very well have been inspired by that which preceded him.
I'm exceeding my question quotient. I grew up in Philadelphia, and when I got my driver's license, I went to Longwood Gardens for dates because it was quiet and no one knew where you were. But it's a beautiful place.
We hope it's still quiet.
Yes, I hope so. So the forms of your structure, did you envision those as plant-like structures also? And did that resonate with the client?
Yeah, I mean, quite literally, we had been looking at that extraordinary stand of sycamore trees. We also, I think, worked with MKA, with Jay Taylor, who's a brilliant structural engineer. So there was a kind of conversation that went back and forth about how to avoid the kind of typical post and beam or the truss, the kind of thing that we would perhaps be drawn to initially. So that kind of reciprocity went back and forth. And of course, it's a botanic garden, so the reference to nature, I think, was something that intuitively resonated.
I think that the other thing for us that was so interesting is it was not only the grove of sycamore trees, but it was also that sense that even their older conservatory, nearly 100 years old today, had a lot of columns in it because they needed the columns to hold it up. And we were struck that the contemporary conservatories that we were seeing around the world with these massive kind of Bucky Fuller domes getting bigger and bigger because they were column-free, so anything could grow. And they felt spatially monotonous and that there's no correlation between the architecture and the landscape. And so we actually were inspired to do something completely different, that the kind of cathedral-like reading of it would enable the architecture and the landscape to be seen as in dialogue with each other and very complementary, and also enabling that perspectival convergence that we were talking about to feel intimate, which is what we love so much about Longwood.
I think there's one, yeah.
You guys are a partnership in a firm. How do you deal with disagreements, or are you guys always on the same wavelength?
Sorry, could you say that again?
The question is, you guys work together as a partner for X number of years. The question is, how do you work together, or do you squabble in terms of...
That's Miriam's question to answer.
You know, we actually have this really wonderful gift. We do the same thing that Craig and Elaine do every morning. We walk from Brooklyn across the Brooklyn Bridge into Manhattan. And that takes us, 45 minutes to an hour. And we call it our debate phase. And we really, really try to work all of our kinks out on the way in. We never do, but we try. And I think we have the good fortune of having a very forgiving and generous office and staff who have learned how to say, oh, you're both right. Those are great points.
You know, it's interesting. It's actually a very important question because I think for so many years, particularly when I was a student, architecture, often male, was also very ego-based, and it was my way or no way. And I think having a partner who's equally engaged and in some ways extraordinarily articulate and passionate means that I at times need to sublimate my ego. And it's different. It's a different way of working that I think makes perhaps our work stronger. It doesn't have that kind of singular voice. We hope it has a singular voice, but it doesn't have that completely dominant ego at its foundational core.